And here we go. The Pacers strike. They make their move. They trade Malcolm Brogdon to the Boston Celtics. First round pick, Aaron Nesmith, some other pieces coming to Indiana. Let's break down every aspect of this deal on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and the Westside Community News. And today, y'all know what we're talking about. It's a weekend bonus episode because Malcolm Brogdon has been dealt away from the Indiana Pacers after many, many days of speculation dating back to the draft on where Brogdon would end up, what his value would be. He is shipped to the Eastern Conference finalist, Boston Celtics, in exchange for 5 players and a 2023 first-round pick. Wow. I was stunned to see Boston, not because they don't make sense. He fits very well with the type of guards that they like, point guard, shooting guard, hybrids. They have that in Smart. They have that in other ball handlers on their team. I just did not think they would be a team trying to get more expensive given their tax bills, given how they've kind of danced around with money in recent seasons. I never really considered them as a team that would be interested in something like this. They have Peyton Pritchard. They have Marcus Smart. They obviously have all their other guards under contract. Derek White, for example, that they traded for last year. But I did not think them as a Brogdon team, despite him fitting very well under what Brad Stevens and the Celtics team sort of like to be and how they're made up. So he's a good fit there. And it just made sense for the Pacers to dive in and finally get this done. Look, it has been talked about ad nauseum why Brogdon did not make sense on the Indiana Pacers anymore. The biggest reason and the most important reason is after acquiring Tyrese Haliburton last season, Malcolm Brogdon's role was not as needed. Part of his allure of joining the Pacers from Milwaukee in the first place, he could handle the ball more often. He could be that lead ball handler more and be more of a leader. And that leadership part is fine and helpful on a young team, but the Pacers have their ball handler. They have their young guy, their face of their franchise in Tyrese Haliburton, who's just as good and is only 21, plays the same position. He will be the guy with the ball all the time for the Pacers going forward. And Brogdon and him could have, in theory, fit if Brogdon would have been more off ball, but as evidenced by their 8, I think, games together this past season, that fit was not good enough to pursue that long term, and especially because the Pacers are clearly shifting into a younger team, into a new era. It just was time. The overlap in skill was the biggest reason for this, and now Tyrese Haliburton has the keys. He is the guy that will have the ball all the time. In fact, we went to Summer League practice today. It was the first time we've been around the Summer League team, and we're not supposed to ask directly about trades in these settings because the NBA moratorium is going on. They're not official. James Boyd of the Indy Star asked assistant coach Ronald Norad, who's the head coach of the Summer League team, what has Tyrese's kind of thinking been this summer transitioning into a lead guard role? A good way to ask about the trade without asking about the trade, right? And Norad said, I think he's all ready for it. This guy has been working like crazy this summer. And then this is the key part here. He really wants this. He really wants the role. So I'm not saying that any like Haliburton pushed the trade or anything, but if Haliburton wants to be your lead guard, he is very, very good already. He's super young and talented. Then you move off of other lead guards. And the Pacers traded away Brogdon. It was time to do this, and it made all the sense in the world, especially to get it done first in free agency, because now they know what pieces they have to then make the rest of their moves, whether that's signings or other trades. Since that's going to be the biggest thing they do, doing it first, getting the pieces and assessing the situation, I think is a smart order of operations choice from the Pacers. So the return, I've talked for 4 minutes and haven't even talked about it. To Boston goes Malcolm Brogdon. To Indiana comes the following 5 players. Aaron Nesmith, a lottery pick. We'll go into more detail on all these guys in the second segment here. Aaron Nesmith, a lottery pick from the 2020 NBA draft. Daniel Theis, a big man, a center who has been on many contenders in his career. The Bulls wanted him to be their center. The Celtics have had him as their center for many playoff runs. Houston brought him in last year, and then Boston wanted him back to be a valuable playoff guy. Another center on the Pacers. We'll talk about what his fit is on this team, but good center, solid guy, but he's 30. He is 30 years old as of now, but again, a quality player, mostly in for his salary reasons. And then 3 guys that many cover the Celtics affectionately refer to as the bench mob. Juwan Morgan, an IU standout. Of course, I love the Juwan Morgans on the Pacers, even if for a brief moment, just for my IU fandom to tie in. Malik Fitz, another back-end roster guy for that Celtics team, and Nick Stauskas, a former 8th overall pick whose career has not panned out to reach that level. Those last three guys, Morgan, Fitz, and Stauskas, all are minimum salary players. Their salary was needed to make the trade legal. I don't think the Pacers have any plans for what those guys could do for the Pacers or elsewhere, but they had to be included to make the salaries work in this deal. And on top of them, the Pacers also get the Celtics 2023 first round draft pick. That is the haul. A first round pick, Daniel Theis, who they can maybe flip for something else, Aaron Nesmith, the 2020 14th overall pick, and 3 minimum dudes. So that might not sound like that much. And I agree, compared to what the chatter was, and even what I didn't hear that his value was high. Like the 10th or 11th pick was too much for Brogdon. But I thought they maybe could get a little more than this. But regardless of that, Nesmith is talented and can play on the wing, and they get a first-round pick for Brogdon. I think that makes sense as a value perspective, even if it doesn't sound amazing. I think it's what the Pacers need, and I think getting off of Brogdon has a lot of value to them as well. So Nesmith is, we'll talk about him again in more detail in the next segment, but Nesmith is a very interesting gamble here, right? As a former lottery pick just 2 years ago, he came out of Vanderbilt, and everybody thought he'd be this awesome shooter, and that sort of panned out. His rookie year, he shot like 37% from three-point range for the Celtics. It looked like he was going to be that shooter. This year, only 27%. That really fell off. But in college, he was, a sniper, 52% on over 8 attempts per game his final year at Vanderbilt. He only played 14 games, but that is a crazy good percentage. That's over 100 attempts. In college, 300 attempts, he shot 41%. Good free throw shooter. Like every projection says, this guy should be a good shooter, and he was a good scorer in general, 23 points per game his final season. So I got picked in the lottery, right? Because he had those skills, good advanced numbers. Like if I was evaluating him as a prospect now, most of the stuff that I immediately am drawn to on a stat sheet at least would make me go, oh, wow, this guy looks pretty good. So he and the 2023 pick are the big draws for the Pacers. Now they have another young guy to plug into their system. You have to imagine, he can be a 2-3. He's only 6'5", but definitely more of a 3 than a 2. Nesmith is, I would say. If he can play on the 3, and I think he'll probably be a 3, he should be in the mix for minutes day one with the Pacers. They got a wing who can, in theory, shoot it. If he can light it up from deep for the Pacers, great. They'll slot him right into their rotation. And he has a lot of swing variance on how this trade will look, depending on how that three-point shot materializes. Obviously, though, the 2023 first-round pick is a huge thing in this as well. Even if the Celtics pick isn't that good, the Pacers will enter next year's draft with 3 firsts, their own, the Cavs, assuming the Cavs make the playoffs, and the Celtics now. And, with the Nets getting worse, the Cavs are pushing on the doorstep of that. The Hornets could, in theory, get worse. Like the Cavs have ways to push their way on into the playoffs next year. So 3 first-round picks is great for the Pacers. So the return, again, if it seems underwhelming, maybe it is. Maybe it is. I don't necessarily think it's underwhelming. I think their valuation of Nesmith is how people will view this trade. If you're into him or you think he can be something for the Pacers, then that's great. And whatever you get for Theis, you have to also consider in the return. And the first-round pick will be an okay first, probably late 20s, but who knows how these seasons will end up going for any team. But the return, if it seems underwhelming, I understand. But I think that this is about what Brogdon's market is. And the always reminder for this kind of stuff is you either think the Pacers intentionally didn't take the best offer for some reason, or you just misread what the market could be. Even I think I misread what the market was for Brogdon a little bit on this one. And they took what offer they presumed to be the best, and that is this one from the Celtics. So 2 more assets that are strong in a first-round pick and Nesmith, and then another one in Theis that could be a part of something else, whether that's the backup center this year for the Pacers, and then maybe moved later in the season. That's basically what happened with him in Houston. And again, we'll talk about him in a second. Or a guy who's flipped pretty quickly, although he can only be traded by himself if the Pacers trade him away still in this offseason. We'll break that all down as this show goes on because there's a lot to cover with this trade. Really quickly, though, guys, let me talk to you about BetOnline.net, your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL playoffs, Stanley Cup Finals just wrapped up, Major League Baseball, and more over at BetOnline. They're your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, sports podcasts, and sports news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head over to the website today or use your mobile device So learn more about the trends in the action over at betonline.net because BetOnline is where the game starts. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, this one's easy. Locked On Celtics, John Corrales will talk to you all about this trade from the Celtics perspective. Brogdon has already spoken to Celtics media, Jared Weiss, about how he's feeling about this deal. If you want to hear more about that, also, you can read it in The Athletic. Let's talk about this return. The value is what it is. You like it or you don't. That's not up to me to tell you what to do. Let's talk about who these players are. And I talked about Nesmith a little bit. I keep wanting to say Nesmith. Nesmith a little bit in the first segment. But some of the alert here is that he's just a former lottery pick, right? 14th overall pick for a reason. And the Celtics scouting department after the top picks isn't like amazing, but it's pretty solid. They have some good hits in the last 5 to 10 years. And Nesmith has had an interesting career because his first year he's only played under 100 games so far in his career. He's been struggling to get on the floor, but the Celtics have been good, right? It's hard sometimes for these first round picks to get on the floor on good teams, right? They made the playoffs 2 years ago before losing to the Nets in the first round, and then this year obviously made the finals. They're good. They're trying to win. It's hard to get these inconsistent developing rookies on the floor. So I wouldn't read too much into his playing time. I would read into some interesting stuff about him. One is the shooting, right? The shooting has been interesting. And that is, again, where I think a lot of this trade, when you look back on it in the future, how it will be evaluated. Right now, you can grade it however you want. But if Nesmith comes to Indiana and his shot translates, and it looks like the guy he could have been out of college, who's a really good shooter, and the free throw percentage has been there in the NBA. His rookie season, he shot really well from three. He took 108 of them and hit 40, right? If he's that guy, this will look okay. They got a wing who can shoot it a little bit in a big deal. And if he can defend at all and they get a 3-and-D young wing, wowie, they nailed it right at that point. So that'll be a lot of his swing, a lot of his appeals. Can that shot materialize? Because some of the other stuff he's done in his career is kind of interesting to me, right? He was supposed to be that shooter, but on the defensive end, his stats in college looked appealing. His block and steal percentage were nice. He can kind of move his feet. I wouldn't call him a good defender at this moment. Young guys typically aren't. But he knows where he's supposed to be. He's not lost or anything, and I think he can get better on that end of the floor. With time, his advanced stats suggest that he was a positive defender for Boston this past season, at least BPM does. So perhaps he can be of service on that end of the floor, and that would be really huge for the Pacers, who have struggled to get wing defense for years and years and years. Having one of them young would be nice. I don't rate him as necessarily, at best, maybe an average defender, but he could be something on that end of the floor. Over 60% of his shots in his career have been threes. And another skill of his that I think is very interesting, his finishing is fantastic. This past season for Boston, 87%. No, that is not a misspeak. 87% from 0 to 3 feet with only 5 dunks, right? So he is finishing well around the basket. So if he can be the Morey ball finisher, right? Good at threes and good at the rim and a decent defender, that's a good player at a young age and a guy you can try to develop. And the biggest appeal for the Pacers, the absolute number one biggest appeal for the Pacers to me, he's 22 years old. They now have a ton of, even more, young guys in their backcourt rotation. If you add Nesmith into this discussion, put him wherever you want. You can have Duarte and Mathurin and Nesmith and Halliburton. 2 of them can be on the court at all times in your backcourt if Nesmith turns out to be a rotation level guy for the Pacers, or even better. So that there's some appeal there with his offensive skills. If his defense can be a little better, that would be really, really helpful. He's not that tall, like he's about Duarte's height. He's probably closer to Mathurin's height than Duarte's, which is on the shorter end of Duarte's height. But if he can be any sort of defender, I think that would obviously be huge for the Pacers, and they'll hope it can be. Like he had some nice shooting games in his career. He's had double-digit scoring nights. Obviously, you'd expect that from a lottery pick. He just hasn't played a ton for the Celtics. I think with the Pacers, he can get a more consistent rotation spot, assuming the Pacers view him as at least a piece to try to develop. And I would guess, based on this trade, that they do. Isaac Harris of Locked On Mavs, who covered Carlisle with Dallas, obviously, said that he thinks Carlisle liked Nesmith in that draft, but he can't perfectly remember. I will, of course, have to ask Greg the next time he is available to talk to you about this sort of stuff. So Nesmith's the big piece. He's the one that will be worth monitoring, especially so this season. If he clicks, it would really speed up the Pacers rebuild. Theis is also an interesting piece in this deal, though. Daniel Theis, awesome screener, right? That is one of his biggest appeals. He's only 6'8", so as a center, he's on the shorter side, but he's a really good screener. He's a mobile defender. He's always got his hands up in the right places. He's a solid big. There's a reason that he keeps ending up on decent teams, right? On Boston when they were really good and were reaching the conference finals, then he goes to Chicago for a little bit. The Rockets signed him to try to, figure out what they could do in the front court with him and Şengün, and realized oh, he's kind of good, but he's clogging our front court. And Boston was like, we'll take you back. We know you're good. So that is sort of telling to me that a team that has had a lot of success in past years determined they want this guy back. They want this guy in on their team for a playoff setting. Started 5 times in the postseason this past season for the Celtics as they went to the finals, 16 games. A playoff contributing backup big is something that every team wants. Not every team has one, but every team wants one. So he still could have some value around the league, I think, which is interesting because of those skills, because he is that awesome screener. He's got that mobility. He's decent on D, and his shooting is just good enough as a center, 33% for his career from deep, that you have to think about what he is or what he's doing when he's more than 15 feet from the basket. You don't have to guard him necessarily, but it's not just like a guy you could totally ignore. So he is a valuable player. He is a skilled big. I've liked a lot of him in the past. Like if you'll recall when the Pacers played the Celtics in the playoffs in 2018-19, I should know that season better off the top of my head. A lot of people assumed the Pacers were going to at least win 1 or 2 games, even without Depot that season, because they were going to dominate on the inside with guys like Sabonis and guys like Turner. And I thought, Theis is good. Guys like Theis is close to as good at the time, at least, as those guys were, because they were still much younger. And that turned out to be the case. The Celtics walked all over the Pacers and swept them in that series. So, look, he's obviously a flawed player, or else he would be starting for good teams all the time. He's over 30 years old, and he's 6'8". But he is a good player. He does have value, positive value, both in this trade and in the NBA. So he will be involved in the thinking of the Pacers now going forward. He also shot, by the way, 79% at the rim last season, 75% for his career. Excellent finisher around the basket. So Theis has some value. Really quick run through the last 3 guys. Juwan Morgan, Malik Fitz, Nick Stauskas. Again, they were part of what some Celtics media have referred to as the bench mob. And Juwan Morgan is a great rebounder. Stauskas can kind of shoot it, 35% from deep for his career. Malik Fitz has never really stuck anywhere or showed much, but maybe they like one of those guys enough to keep him around, but I don't know if that they necessarily have a future with this franchise. We'll talk about why in the last segment here, but finishing up a little combo here with Theis. This is definitely, I think they'll keep Nesmith because he's young and could be good. Theis kind of shakes up the Pacers center plans to me, or could be dealt again. One of those two things, because now they have Batadze, the Pacers do. They have Isaiah Jackson. They have Miles Turner. They have Daniel Theis, even maybe Terry Taylor in the mix. And Theis is 30, and the rest of those guys are 26 and younger, right? He's clearly the age standout of that group. And maybe they want a veteran big. Some teams, young teams, like having that vet big. The Rockets signed Theis last year to their young team because they wanted a veteran big, right? That is not crazy to me that the Pacers could keep Theis. But if they do, I would imagine that they move. I imagine that a Turner trade would keep Theis around, because if they keep Turner around, they have their vet big. It's Miles Turner. And then Theis does not have much value to them, right? They'd rather just use Jackson, Taylor, and Goga as their backup bigs, and they don't need Daniel Theis. But if they do trade Turner, which has been rumored as an option this summer for the Pacers, Chad Buchanan said they're not shopping him, but they will take calls. Yeah, maybe then they would want to keep Daniel Theis on the team and have him be a backup for that team or be a part of whatever plans they have. So the trouble here is, and I'll keep this a little short because I might talk about it in the last segment a little bit. If he's aggregated in this trade from the Celtics and all of their salaries are stacked together and the Pacers stay over the cap, then Theis has to be traded alone. They can't aggregate him with other salaries in a bigger trade. So they could trade Theis for guys around his salary number or into a trade exception to free up cap, I suppose. They could only trade him alone. And so what they could get in return is very limited by that. But they still could deal him before the season starts, even in July. Even they could even figure out what the deal is before they finish the trade with Boston if they wanted, in theory. So they could decide to move on from him, I think. But they could also, this is me just totally hedging, but they could also keep him if they move Turner. But I think that they have too many bigs now. And for a team that, let's just easily transition to our closing topic here, what does the Pacers roster look like now? For a team that has a lot of players now, they just made a 5-for-1 trade. They'll have to make some of these decisions on where they are moving on from guys. They have 22 players at least rumored to be in the Pacers ecosystem right now. Let's talk about why that's not really the case and what it could mean for the Pacers roster. They dealt away Malcolm Brogdon for all these pieces. What next? What is their roster now? Where will they go with their next moves? Really quickly, before we do that, I got to talk to you guys about Truebill. Do you know why? Free trials renew without your consent. It's a business scam out to get you. Do not let greedy corporations pocket your money. Download Truebill to take control of your subscriptions. It's a new app that helps you identify and stop paying for subscriptions you don't need, want, or simply forgot about. On average, people save up to $720 per year with Truebill because companies make subscriptions hard to cancel. Truebill makes it easy. Link your accounts. Truebill will cancel your unwanted subscriptions in one tap. And your Truebill concierge is there when you need them to cancel unwanted subscriptions, so you don't have to. They have over 2 million users and have helped them save over $100 million. Don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling them today at Truebill.com/LockedOnNBA. Go right now. Truebill.com/LockedOnNBA can save you thousands a year. Truebill.com/LockedOnNBA. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, I had to choose between the two teams. I'll go with Locked On Timberwolves, the team that traded for Rudy Gobert. Huge trade. You could do Locked On Jazz if you want. That's where the boss man who founded this network is at. Both choices are fine. Rudy Gobert from Utah to Minnesota. Wow, blockbuster. Either of those teams' shows should be fascinating this weekend, assuming they're also doing bonus content, which you have to imagine they will, covering those trades. So what is the Pacers roster now? Remember, they had 12 already. They traded 1 for 5. That's 16. They also have 4 Exhibit 10 guys and 2 draft picks. the second round picks, Kendall Brown and Andrew Nembhard. I forgot his name somehow. And Matherin's not technically under contract, so they technically had 11 before that. But none of that matters. That is 22 players. 15 potential roster guys. 4 Exhibit 10 guys that have been rumored. Eli Brooks, Jermaine Samuels. I can't remember all 4 of them. Fambo Zhang, and the 4th one who is escaping me now. Tevin Brown. There we go. That is 22 players. You can only carry 20 in the offseason. So the reason the Pacers are allowed to do this is that they haven't signed those Exhibit 10 guys yet. They technically haven't signed their draft picks yet either, right? So they're allowed to, they're not getting around a rule. The trade hasn't happened yet, and we'll talk about why in a second. So they're allowed to, in theory, in flux right now. They have 22 guys kind of in their ecosystem surrounding the orbit of the Pacers. And they have to get that number to 20 for camp, or the number will be 20 for camp. It could be 19, but it will be 20. So stuff will still have to happen if you include those Exhibit 10s. And I really doubt the Pacers will back out of those Exhibit 10s. Maybe they even convert one of them to a two-way. They have no one on two-ways right now. Now that it's the new league year, it's July 1st. It's the 2022-23 season now. Pacers have no one under contract on a two-way right now. Anyway, they have to have moves coming up, the Pacers do. Because they have 22 guys in their orbit, they have to get that number down. They have a lot of time to do it, but they have to get that number down. So that means there could be trades coming. There's probably waivers coming. There's definitely more coming for the Pacers. And there's a chance this is super boring. There's a chance that Malik Fitz, Nick Stauskas, and Juwan Morgan show up to Indiana and sign some papers and do a physical. Maybe they don't even do a physical. They might just show up to Indiana, sign some papers, and then get cut immediately. They're probably happy to get traded because as part of this deal, to make the salaries work, all 3 of those players' contracts got guaranteed for this coming season. So they get a bunch of money because they're traded. So maybe the Pacers, because their salaries are guaranteed, decide to keep one of them. And only cutting 2 would get the Pacers to 20. That makes sense to me, potentially. Stauskas has had some success in his career. I suppose he's played in some playoff games, ironically, for Boston this past season. Has been around in his career and can kind of shoot it. But he's the oldest of those 3. He's 28. Malik Fitz seems like the most obvious cut. He's going to turn 25 in 3 days on the 4th of July. He's been a fine guy on Utah, and I think he's on the Clippers for a little bit. But it doesn't seem like an NBA guy. Juwan Morgan has had multiple stops now. Utah for 2 years, and then Toronto and Boston this past season. He's a center who's 6'7". So if the Pacers identify one of those guys as one guy they might want in camp, maybe they'll keep them. But I think that the Pacers might just waive all of them or try to include them in a bigger deal to maybe move off from them. Perhaps they trade 2 of them for another team's minimum player with some cash or a second-round pick or something, so they don't have to just eat those salaries. But that is a possibility for the Pacers now, is cutting the one, 2, or 3 of those guys to change their roster. Now, what else the Pacers could do to make their roster smaller and fit it into 20 after trading Brogdon, a huge trade, is making some of their vet trades that have been well reported and documented, or not as well reported and documented, right? Maybe they trade Theis. Maybe that's one of them. The guy we just talked about last segment doesn't really fit their timeline. They have young centers on their team. They have 3 young centers on their team, really. Maybe 4 if you count Terry Taylor. Doesn't seem like Theis fits unless they deal some of those guys. Maybe they trade Goga because they have Terry Taylor, Isaiah Jackson, and Miles Turner, and they say, we don't need another young big. Maybe they do that. TJ McConnell. They have 4 young backcourt guys as is, And they drafted Nembhard. They have Nembhard and Nesmith and Duarte and Mathurin and Halliburton. I mean, that's a lot of young guys who can touch the ball or play 2 and 3 or 1 in Halliburton's case. And I probably forgot someone there. I have the feeling I did. So that's a lot of minutes to go around there. Dwayne Washington, there we go. I knew I forgot somebody. So, does McConnell's spot on the Pacers suddenly seem a little rockier? I don't think so. They didn't get a point guard in this trade, but just in general, they have a lot of their potential backcourt of the future set up, right? Perhaps McConnell could be dealt. And Goga, I already talked about him. Theis, maybe Miles Turner's in the mix as a guy who could be dealt in this as well, just because he's in the last year of his contract as a veteran. He is good. He could fetch something, but because his contract is expiring, you have to listen to those calls. So perhaps Turner is a guy in this mix. And Buddy Hield's been long discussed as well. I mean, the fact that I haven't even said his name and I just said a million guards tells you a lot about his situation. So there's still some stuff that makes sense for the Pacers to deal, but it would not stun me to see them make a really big aggregation trade where they maybe trade like 2 or 3 guys for one really expensive dude and scoop some assets up that way. Or they just cut some of these minimum guys and try to operate within the parameters they had kind of originally thought of for themselves this summer. Another roster part of this trade is, even with now having a lot of players in their orbit, the Pacers freed up some cap space. Malcolm Brogdon set to make $22.6 million this season. The combined salaries of Theis, Nesmith, Morgan, Fitz, and Stauskas is just a bit over $18 million, 18.2-ish. So the Pacers free up about $4 million in space. And if you've been keeping track of the Pacers cap space over the last couple of days or listening to this podcast very often, you'll know that they now have about 31 million in cap space. That's an interesting number because that is maximum salary cap space for a player who has 0 to 6 years of service in the NBA. For a 25% max salary slot guy, the Pacers can now just sign them. They do not have to go through any hurdles of sign and trades or any complicated things like that. Look, the only guy that makes any sense in this discussion is Ayton. I still, in my seat, don't think it necessarily is perfect for the Pacers team construction, but if you can sign a guy like Ayton without giving up assets, again, he's young, talented, that makes sense for a Pacers team that would like to have young guys. Perhaps they do it. They now have the salary cap space to do it without making any moves, without making it a sign and trade, nothing. And they could mix some other guys potentially in there. Colin Sexton's still out there, although they don't need guards. There are other guys that make some sense as giving them some money, but not very many. But they could perhaps take in somebody. They could still stay over the cap. They could still decide to stay over the cap and use some trade exceptions. There are options for the Pacers now. But Ayton remains one, and the max contract slot is there. And I'm not reporting anything with Ayton. I'm just saying they have the money to sign him if they would like to. They could also take an unwanted salary much easier. They can basically, if they trade Buddy Hield to another team in the NBA now, because they can have up to 31 million in space, Buddy Hield alone at his 20 million number, he's over that really in salary this year, gets you over 50 million in space to take somebody in. Nobody in the NBA yet makes 50 million. I think next season is the first time we'll see 50 million as a player's salary. So the Pacers can now effectively trade Buddy Hield for any player in the NBA legally in a trade. Obviously, there'd be other assets or pieces involved, but that is a possibility now for them to do. And I know the Westbrook thing's kind of become a joke, but just as an example, they could send just Buddy Hield to the Lakers and then get Westbrook back, and they would take on a bunch of money. They'd have to take on first-round picks or a young player or something, but they could do that now if they wanted as an option. But that's just an example. I don't think I would do that unless the Lakers gave up a ton of first. Anyway, the final roster part I would like to talk about here, there's really two. One is a short one. This trade cannot legally happen and be finalized until July 9th. Juwan Morgan signed with the Celtics initially this past season on April 9th. And a player cannot be traded until 3 months after they sign their original deal with the team. So Morgan was on some 10 days with them, but he cannot be signed or traded until 3 months after April 9th. So he cannot be traded until July 9th, which means the moratorium will end on July 6th, and Brogdon still will be on the Pacers for 3 more days. This trade cannot happen until July 9th. I think that's noteworthy. It won't really matter. All the teams decide their moves and orders of operations, usually, most of them at least, during the moratorium. Although a Kevin Durant trade happening sooner and allowing all the rest of the dominoes would help the Pacers if it happens before the moratorium ends. They can set all their stuff in place. Then this trade will become official on July 9th. The last thing here is this trade could, in theory, be expanded, just thinking about what this looks like. Not like adding in more assets to the Pacers or anything like that. I think the terms are set. But in theory, and I'll talk about this on tomorrow's show, I'm going 7 days a week during free agency. Ricky Rubio just inked a deal or agreed to a deal with Cleveland, for example. That's the first Pacers incumbent player to go somewhere else. In theory, what could happen is, the Pacers trade Rubio and a sign and trade to the Cavs for like Cedi Osman, for example. And then Cedi Osman comes to the Pacers and goes into the Doug McDermott trade exception. So then the Pacers create a trade exception for Ricky Rubio. And then they could use that trade exception to take in Nesmith and expand the Celtics trade to maybe make it a 3-team trade and slide some pieces around that way. Or do a sign and trade with the Cavs that then sets up a trade with the Celtics. There's a lot of parts that could change the structure slightly, and maybe that changes the amount of Brogdon's traded player exception that the Pacers will get for him, assuming they stay over the cap to that point. That could change maybe minor things about the Pacers roster construction along the way, but it would not stun me if something happens either to fold into that trade or right before that trade that kind of slightly tweaks it. I don't think it'll be dramatic, but the not changes the pieces involved, but changes the structure from a trade perspective. Without getting too dorky, there are ways that it could be slightly expanded that kind of benefit every single team that would be involved. So if you have questions about this or think I missed the mark in part of this discussion, I'm on Twitter at TEastNBA. If you're on YouTube, boom, right there. And if you're listening elsewhere, thank you for stopping on your 4th of July weekend and taking at least 30 minutes to listen to what I have to say about this trade from the Pacers and the Celtics. We'll, of course, continue to talk about the Pacers free agency moves. Tomorrow, a Sunday show. Ricky Rubio obviously got dealt. What does that mean for the Pacers? How can they do that sign and trade I just described? Will they even do it? And then I have some Miles Turner thoughts, actually, because some other stuff has happened around the league that I think kind of impacts what I think about his value and how it could work in free agency. And I'll think of a third segment. There's so much to talk about in free agency these days. There's going to be something else to add. And we got to talk to Ben Matherin today for the first time after his first practice. I could do that. Summer League's about to start. There's a million things. You don't want to miss it. Everybody loves this time of year in the NBA. And we'll keep it coming for you on the Locked On Pacers podcast. So I hope everybody's having a great Friday, Saturday, Sunday, whenever you're listening. And we will see you tomorrow.